as I said, my name's Harriet Bunning. I work with Eileen Wall at SOUC, and we've heard a little bit already this afternoon, about kind of the main focus of GENTORE being resilience and efficiency. I'm particularly interested in resilience, and there's a range of different definitions of resilience, but I think something that's kind of thought about quite a lot when we talk about resilience, things like heat stress, and so we can talk therefore about climate resilience, the ability of animals to deal with heat stress. And I think probably everyone here would agree that our cattle in the tropics being climate resilient is really important. I'm just going to give you a little bit of evidence for this, but I hope that that's quite obvious to everybody. So this is just a graph here that I've taken from a study in East Africa. The far left bar shows the kind of historic. We can see that kind of 60% of cattle are experiencing moderate or extreme heat stress. And then as we go to the right, those are just kind of increasing climate change, so either increasing time or increasing severity predictions. And we can expect, well, these guys are predicting that a higher proportion of cattle will be under either moderate or extreme heat stress over time. And this is really kind of mirrored globally across the tropics. This is just a graph from a different study, also published, I think, last year, looking at anywhere on this graph, anywhere on this figure that is yellow or to dark red. These are animals that are experiencing increased frequency of extreme heat stress. So cattle in the tropics definitely need to be climate resilient. But if we're talking here in the UK, is this really an issue? Should we be bothering with all of this breeding for resilient cattle if it's not really an issue they're going to be facing? If we just looked at this study, I think probably the answer would be no. We can see here I've ringed the UK and it's grey, suggesting that we're not expecting any increase in extreme heat stress for cattle in the UK. But if we kind of delve deeper into it and look at individual studies, this was some research done back in 2015 for a Scottish dairy herd. And even within this Scottish dairy herd, at extremes of THI, both low and high, milk production decreased. So that might suggest that if we had some more resilient dairy animals, maybe this drop wouldn't be seen. But that's dairy, and there is quite a lot of research in this area within dairy. We know a lot less about beef. So really, my main aim of this work was to answer this question, which is whether really affecting growth and carcass traits in beef cattle, is this something we should be worried about? To help answer this question, I had access to some really great data sets, both in terms of weather and beef traits, so I'm just going to go through those quickly. First of all, in terms of weather, I used the Met Office HAD UK grid database, which is just brilliant in terms of its resolution. It's every kilometre square across the whole of the UK and the weather on every day. So we've got our maximum temperature, minimum temperature, and rainfall for that day. Brilliantly, I also have the location data for all of the animals within my beef data set, so I know exactly where they are in the UK. I can join these together. And my first when I have all this huge amounts of data, I thought I'd just start off by taking a nice average. So we've got the average maximum temperature, minimum temperature, and rainfall that an animal experienced across the whole of its life. But just taking an average didn't feel like it was really getting into kind of exactly the weather that the animals experienced. So rather than just that, I thought we're interested in extremes, right? So let's count how many extreme days an animal is experiencing through its life. And I express this per day of life. So when we come to look at the regression coefficients, they look particularly large. It's worth remembering that, just because obviously animals that are older at slaughter have a greater chance of experiencing more extreme days. Firstly, I start off with heat waves. That's what we keep talking about, heat stress. So heat waves was definitely going to be important. I used the Met Office definition, which was just at least 2 consecutive days, or more than 2 consecutive days, where the maximum temperature was over a specific threshold. This threshold varied between 25 and 28 degrees C, depending on where they are in the UK, just because hotter regions need a higher threshold. I then also looked at cold waves, where I kind of had a similar definition, where it's more than 2 consecutive days, where the temperature didn't reach 0 degrees. And then I was also interested in extremes of rainfall, since I had that within the data. I thought that was potentially interesting. So I looked at dry and wet days, and for the definition of these, I just used the 10th and 90th percentile within the data set. So dry days are less than 0.12 mil, and wet days are more than 7.65 mil. Then in terms of the animals, I started off, we're interested in beef, so let's have a look at the end, let's have a look at what these cattle are doing when they're actually in abattoir. We have access to this brilliant data set which has got abattoir records across the whole of the UK. I did quite a lot of data cleaning to just make sure that when I come on to talk about the factors in my model, I had to reduce and take out quite a lot of animals, but still ended up with over 1.6 million animals that were alive between 2000 and 2019. For these, I had specific carcass traits I'm interested in, the cull carcass weight, fat score and conformation, I'm going to talk about on a scale of 1 to 15, but this is basically the Europe grading system, age at slaughter, and then I was also interested in a growth trait, which I simply took carcass weight and divided by age at slaughter. I'm going to call this average daily carcass gain, but it's worth taking into account it's not including birth weight, and cull carcass weight isn't live weight, but we'll call it carcass growth. As well as the end of life, it will be also interesting to take a kind of smaller snapshot across the lifetime of these animals. So I had a look at some calves. This was in the Scottish Beef Efficiency Scheme, and we had over 270,000 calf records who were alive between 2016 and 2019, and these are just in Scotland, not across the whole UK. We have a trait that's called, I'm going to call 200-day weight, but was actually recorded anywhere between 100 and 300 days. And then again, a growth trait, which is just the weight divided by the age. I didn't have their birth weight, so I can't include that. So these were all analysed using general linear models. This is the kind of general model outline. To go into a little bit more detail, apologies, possibly a little bit small on the screen. Each row here is a model that was run. So I ran an individual model for every trait that I was interested in. In terms of the weather, initially I looked at these average weather parameters, so average daily maximum temperature, minimum temperature, average daily rainfall. I also found some interactions that were important, particularly the interaction between maximum and minimum temperature and the interaction between minimum temperature and rain. There were other carcass traits that were included as covariates in the model. This was simply because it had been found to be important in previous analyses. I then did the same thing, but this time looking at the frequency of extreme weather events. So for every trait, I was interested in the heat wave frequency, cold wave frequency, dry day frequency, and wet day frequency. So these were all included in the model. To try and account for some of the other variation, I included some other factors, particularly sex. In the carcass database, we had females, castrated males, or entire males, but in the calf, I only know whether they were male or female. In terms of breeds, I defined this simply using the BCMS code. There were 47 different breeds in the abattoir and 26 in the calf. It's important to note I only included animals where their breed had at least 1,000 records. And then something that I was particularly worried about is that there might be this interaction between weather and kind of farming system. So I really wanted to include some contemporary groups. For both data analyses, I used a birth herd year season contemporary group, and then obviously the calf don't have finishing, but for the abattoir analysis, I include a finishing herd year season, which is where the animal spent the last 60 days of life. I also included only animals that had at least 5 animals within these contemporary groups. So let's have a look at some of the results. As you can imagine from all this analysis, there's an awful lot of results, so I just thought I'd kind of highlight a few bits, but I'm happy to go back if anyone wants to discuss any of the rest of these. I thought of, because I've got these similar types of traits in the abattoir and the calf data, I thought I'd have a look and see whether they're responding similarly. So these are regression coefficients with the standard errors in brackets. So we can see broadly a similar pattern. So for carcass weight, animals that experience increased average daily minimum temperatures tend to have heavier carcasses, and this is the same for calves, are also heavier. And an increased rainfall across the lifetime of an animal tends to decrease carcass weight, and this is the same for calf weights. So in the purple boxes, we can also see this pattern follows similarly for growth rates, so both daily minimum and daily maximum temperatures, increases in those reduced growth rates for both carcasses and calves. And I think something worth highlighting at this point is that it looks from these regression coefficients like the calves were more significantly affected potentially, or more strongly affected than the carcasses were by weather. Something I did want to highlight here, the kind of big difference is the direction of response to rainfall. So increased rainfall led to higher, faster growing carcasses, but slower growing calves. Also like to highlight that there were a lot of these interaction effects that were really important. So particularly for carcass growth rate, if you increase, it looks like if you just increase Tmax or Tmin, you're going to see reduced carcass growth rates, but actually the interaction effect is significant and positive. So this means that if you increase Tmax, so the effect of increasing Tmax, this negative effect of increasing Tmax, is less if an animal is also experiencing a higher minimum temperature. One thing I was a little bit worried about here is, I've often, when I've shown these results, people have picked this out, is that increasing minimum temperatures seem to lead to heavier calves but lower growth rates. And initially I was a bit concerned that this might mean that there was an effect on daily minimum temperatures of when the calves were weighed. But actually, I think this is simply a factor of the significant interaction term. So we're probably actually seeing a positive effect of minimum temperatures on growth rates. So just to kind of summarize all these, really I want to say is that average daily weather does have significant effects on the traits, but the story isn't a clear one. Some of these are beneficial, some of these kind of are detrimental to beef breeding. When we come to look at the frequency of extreme weather, the story is much clearer. First of all, I just want to point out before we talk about the significant results that broadly cold waves didn't seem to have an effect. The frequency of cold waves didn't seem to have effect except a negative effect on conformation. So just to highlight for you, everything in red here is more extreme weather is bad for beef breeding, except for, interestingly, extremes of rainfall seem to improve conformation. I'd be very interested if anyone has any ideas about this. Also, just to highlight that I've made fat class here grey just simply because there isn't a kind of ideal improved, increasing or decreasing fat class isn't ideal, the intermediate is desired. So just to summarise this, really, an increase in frequency of extreme weather generally is bad for us as cattle breeders, beef cattle breeders. So when we come to interpret these results, I think there's some great potential that people could use in terms of modelling, but I think it's really worth highlighting that these aren't necessarily direct effects. We're not measuring just heat stress on the animals. These could be indirect and direct. So yes, it could be that the weather is having a physiological effect on the animal or even on the behaviour of the animal. But it's quite likely that also a lot of this weather effect, particularly the rainfall, is actually affecting the feed of the animal. So it's affecting the growth and the composition of the feed, and that affects the quality and availability of feed for the cattle. And I also think there's the potential that there's some management decisions here. If the grass isn't growing, perhaps the farmer is buying in some extra concentrate to feed the cattle, and that's affecting some of these carcass traits. But in terms of takeaway messages, I think I can say that climate resilience is going to be important in UK beef production, and from these results, it could already be important. If we're expecting to see a 1 degree increase in average daily maximum temperatures, we're going to see reduction in growth rates, both calf growth rates by around 50 grams per day and carcass growth rates by around 6 grams per day. Although it's worth noting that in terms of these averages, the average weather, not all of the stories are bad. Carcass conformation might actually improve. But I think the real key finding from my perspective is this increase in frequency of extreme weather is definitely, from these results, pretty much bad across the board. So an increase in frequency of heat waves by 1 heat wave per 100 days of life would reduce carcass weights by around 200 grams, and really importantly would increase age at slaughter by around 3 days. These are going to have negative impacts for farmer profit, but also in terms of the environmental impact of beef farming. So hopefully you're happy from everything I've shown you today that it looks like there's no change, if we don't do anything in terms of the resilience of our beef cattle, climate change could lead to negative impacts on beef production, both in terms of economic but also the environmental impact of beef farming. And there's obviously a range of mitigation strategies. That's where we go from here. There's some really simple, easy ones, things like simple management strategies, such as providing shelter for animals in the field, and these have been suggested plenty of times by lots of authors. But there's also some more interesting ones where we look at long-term weather forecasting and change our feeding strategies according to those. And then particularly related to GENTORE, there's this idea that we can maybe select for resilient genotypes, and that's what I'm beginning to look into more now. Is there the offspring of certain sires more or less likely to be affected by the weather. So with that, I'd like to thank lots of people for providing brilliant data, BCMS, the Scottish Government, Met Office, and all the abattoirs involved. Thank the EU for funding the GENTORE project, and thank you for listening.